Hey there, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. This is Kevin and Richard from RPH Ally going through the men's channel and talking about something that is near and dear to our heart, no pun intended. We're talking about red meat today. And Richard has a really interesting presentation to show kind of the space, get a little bit better idea of, what is behind the red meat talk. And I'll switch it right over to Richard right now for that.
Yeah, so awesome to be here and talking about this on the Men's Health channel because it's a question I get all the time when people are talking to me and I'm asking them, well, what are you trying to do to improve your health? And the number one thing they say is, or one of the top things they say is, well, I'm reducing my intake of red meat. And I say, why? And they say, well, because I think red meat is bad for me. And I said, okay. And then I begin to educate them on this whole reason why, for most people, intake of red meat is not a problem. And so I'm going to share my screen and we're going to dive into this.
Awesome. And me being a farming kid, Richard, like growing up on a ranch, like that has always been an interesting family thing of dealing with that kind of move toward not wanting red meat. So I'm really excited, even from a like background perspective, to hear more.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see the screen.
Uh, we can see the screen right now. It looks good.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, it really does look good, right? I mean, that's some nice steak right there. So, why do I eat red meat? Um, the number one thing is, to me, nutrient density, right? And so I eat about 2 times a week. I'll eat red meat. And people may be like, oh, 2 times a week, that's a lot. Well, I eat 19 meals a week. So I eat 3 meals a day, Monday through Saturday. And then Sundays, I only eat once to fast. So I eat 2 times of those meals. So 2 out of 19 times, I eat red meat. So that's only 10% of my meals. That's not very significant, right? I vary what I eat. I eat fish mostly when I'm out because I can't cook fish. I eat seafood. I eat pork. I eat chicken. I eat turkey, shrimp, scallops. Those I eat basically all the types of meat, but I
Now,
vary it.
now you're making me starving, buddy. Scallop talk and fish in between there, and throwing red meat on there. You're gonna have to do a cookout afterwards.
Yeah, right. Welcome to Texas, right? But when we look at nutrient density, meat is one of the most nutrient dense sources out there. It's a great source of protein, and it's more bioavailable protein. We know that as pharmacists, bioavailability is huge. And so, if you look at the protein digestibility score, it's basically a score of how well, or you can use it as a score of the protein quality, basically. And that score goes up to 1, and protein is 0.9, where plant sources are zero point 0.5 to zero point 0.7. So we're talking about very high quality protein, and then you get all the essential amino acids, the amino acids that we can't make, we have to eat. Where if you're primarily plant based, you have to get that from combining all different sorts of plants.
Right.
And then you have the minerals, things like zinc, phosphorus, iron, selenium. If you talk to people who run micronutrient testing, you'll often see deficiencies in these things. They're not uncommon. And the minerals are also more bioavailable when we get them from meat sources, especially iron. Iron deficiency is pretty common. We diagnose that all the time in the clinic. And the meat sources of iron are the heme iron is more bioavailable. You absorb it better. And then also going back to the protein, when you look at the protein composition, there's more leucine, and leucine is kind of the gateway for muscle protein synthesis. So for me, someone who's still very active, that's very important to me because I don't want to lose my muscle mass. So
Mhm.
getting a animal source of protein, red meat, to me and for my goals is better than a plant source of protein. And then you look at vitamins B2, B3, B5, B12, B6. All of these are very important. And we see B12 deficiencies fairly commonly these days. And these are great sources of these vitamins. If you can afford grass fed, grass finished, it is better. It has a better nutrient profile, it has a better fat profile. And then we're going to talk about it actually has a better environmental profile. But you actually have omega 3 fatty acids, and we know that omega 3s are important for not only heart health, but brain health. Then you have other beneficial substances like taurine. Taurine is an amino acid. It has antioxidant properties. It protects against oxidative stress. It helps with electrolyte balance. It helps with bile formation. That's a whole nother topic for another day. There's a rash of people who have dysfunctional gallbladders. Part of that's what we eat, part of that's obesity. That's a whole different topic for another day.
Part of that's the drugs we take. Yeah, no,
The medications we take, yeah, absolutely. Carnitine. Carnitine is a really cool substance. It actually helps with the transport of long chain fatty acids to the mitochondria to get burned for energy. Carnosine is well known by the bodybuilding community. If you take beta alanine, the reason you take beta alanine is for carnosine. Carnosine is a buffer for acid. And so when you're working out, you build up acidic substances in your muscles, and that actually drives muscle fatigue. And so carnosine can actually help with muscle endurance. Ubiquinone is the active version of CoQ10. We know CoQ10 is a very important antioxidant. We also know that CoQ10 is very important for cellular respiration, right? It's part of the cellular respiration chain where we actually make ATP. Glutathione is the major antioxidant in the body, major detoxifier. Creatine is like my favorite supplement ever. 5 grams of creatine a day has antioxidant properties, improves brain cognition, improves muscle endurance. If you're working out, improves muscle strength. It's also the most well-studied supplement on the planet, and it's very safe. And then choline. Choline's important for neurotransmitters. It's important for membrane phospholipids, so actually the outside of our cells. And then conjugated linoleic acid, or CLAs. CLAs have antioxidant properties. They're immunomodulatory. They help with insulin resistance. In fact, supplementation with CLAs in men has been shown to reduce visceral adipose tissue. So these are some of the reasons why I take it.
Richard, one of the pieces I want to touch on, because you and I talked about this a little while ago, is some of the recent data and not so recent data on choline and creatine, amongst the others, really was showing some things related to fertility, women's health, men's health, and pregnancy, like seeing those being highly beneficial in reproductive and regenerative processes. And I love that you point those two out as being major components that you're benefiting from meat, because the data is there.
Yeah, absolutely. Most people don't get enough choline intake. The main source of choline in our nutrition is eggs and meat. So if you're avoiding eggs and meat, you're not getting enough choline. If you're pregnant, for the love of God, please, if you can, eat eggs and meat because of the choline. That's very important for developing brain. So fat. We're going to talk about this more in a minute. And why am I talking about this? Most of the meat I eat is now lean meats. I tend to stay away from fattier cuts of meat just because from an energy balance perspective, it's easier to overconsume fats just because they provide more energy than protein or carbohydrates. So if I'm eating lean meat, I can actually eat more, which I like to eat. So I'm primarily sticking with lean cuts of meat. Approximately 40% of the fat in the lean is saturated fat, 48% in the fatty compartment. And it depends on the type of fat, depends. Beef is mostly palmitic acid, some stearic acid, lamb and mutton is equal. And then your polyunsaturated fatty acid percent can vary depending on it. Now, why am I talking about this? Because most people will tell you, oh, fatty acids are, especially saturated fatty acids, are bad, right? Well, one recent cohort study found a lower risk of diabetes and hypertension with higher intake of stearic acid. We're going to talk about this more in a minute because that's a really key component. Now, when we're talking about red meat, we're talking about unprocessed red meat. And there is a difference between processed and unprocessed. So this is from the NOVA criteria. You have raw and minimally processed foods. This is basically foods as nature has them come. If you look at that top box, what is that? You can clearly identify what those are. They don't need labels. You know what they are. So things like fruits and leaves and roots and meat, eggs, milk. And then minimally processed is stuff that has to undergo something like freezing, chilling, drying, crushing, grinding, pasteurization, fermenting, and packaging. So those are the minimally processed. So not really much has been done to change the actual substance of the food. It's like you will go to a farmer's market and get a carrot versus you get a package of baby carrots that's been cut up and packaged, right? That's a minimally processed food, where the carrots from the farmer's market is a raw food. Then you have your processed culinary ingredients. These are condiments. These are things like oils. These are things that are extracted from the raw foods. And then you do things like pressing, grinding, milling, refining. It does not include hydrogenation or modified starches. That gets you into the ultra processed food component. And these are usually single macronutrient items. And then you have your processed foods. So processed foods typically take and combine food products from group 1 and 2. And then you add in baking or cooking or smoking or fermenting or packing. These are things like canned veggies and meats. These are things like cheese and ham. For meats, bacon, ham, salami, corned beef, jerky, hot dogs, lunch meats, chicken nuggets. Most deli meats, some deli meats can be minimally processed depending on, if they just like oven roasted it and put some celery juice in there to maintain some form of antioxidant
Right.
defense, then that would be a minimally packaged deli meat, and that's typically what I get. I'll eat deli meat, but I look for the stuff that's minimally processed. And then ultra processed foods are things that are created by a series of industrial
Look at
techniques.
nugget there, not to use that as a pun. Definitely use it as a pun. You know me well enough. But you said the minimally processed deli meats. I think that's a really convenient thing for people to know. Where when I'm going to the grocery store, I'm looking for a minimally processed deli meat. Where am I going?
Yeah, so I'm looking for, me, I always read labels, right? So I'm looking at the back and I'm looking for things that are, like I said, oven roasted, things that don't have added sugar, things that don't have added nitrates or nitrites. And you can basically, they'll have like two or three ingredients. It'll be like meat, water, celery juice, or something like that, right?
Awesome.
And that's how you can kind of tell. And then they haven't been smoked or cured or anything like that. Maybe they've been oven baked. And we're going
Yeah,
to talk about the cooking and how cooking can affect this and in later slides.
perfect.
The ultra processed stuff is your junk food, right? These are things created by a series of industrial techniques and processes. These are things like candy bars, protein bars, soda, chips, things that have been dramatically transformed from the whole source that it originally came in. So we talked about fat earlier, and one of the reasons people tell me, "Oh, I don't eat red meat because I'm trying to reduce saturated fat intake." And the saturated fat thing comes from the diet heart hypothesis, started in the 50s by Ansel Keys and his 7 countries study. And we've basically been telling people that saturated fat is a boogeyman and causes heart disease in everybody. Well, this was a Cochrane analysis from 2018. Showed that reducing saturated fat reduced CVD events, but then it didn't reduce all these other things: total mortality, CVD mortality, CHD mortality, fatal heart attacks, non-fatal heart attacks, CHD events. And then when they actually did a sensitivity analysis to look at the trials that actually were able to reduce saturated fat intake and exclude the trials that weren't, there was a null effect. So there was no reduction in cardiovascular disease events. So this trial basically showed that reducing saturated fat did not prevent any of these conditions listed.
Wow.
And then it goes on. So this is another meta-analysis. It was of 19 studies, and this was basically came out after the AHA still said we should reduce saturated fat intake. And you can read what it says on the screen here. This is pretty inflammatory, right? That the AHA's meta-analysis only included 4 trials, and these trials had serious methodological flaws and didn't meet all the inclusion criteria. And
Wow.
then the meta-analyses of observational studies found no association between saturated fat intake and heart disease. And then the meta-analyses of randomized control trials were inconsistent but tended to show no association. So this is another study showing no association between saturated fat intake and heart disease. And then it gets better. So if you look at the observational studies, because a lot of the observational studies were like, oh, people eating red meat have more heart disease.
Right.
Well, what we know is people who eat the most red meat are more likely to be overweight or obese, have lower physical activity, currently smoke, they eat less fruit and vegetables, they eat less fiber, they eat more saturated fat and they eat more added sugar. So if I said that person, if you could like imagine who that person is, you would imagine someone who's probably pretty unhealthy, right?
Yeah.
So that was the problem here, is that the people who eat the most red meat have a lot of other confounding factors. And that's one of the main limitations of observational studies. So whenever I look at something, I look at mechanistic studies because I like mechanisms. I look at observational studies, and if the mechanism and the observational study trend in a direction, I'm like, okay, there's maybe something here. And then I look for outcomes data. I look for randomized controlled trials and meta analyses. If I'm looking at a like lab marker like TMAO, we're going to talk about TMAO, then I look for Mendelian randomization studies, because then these Mendelian randomization studies can actually prove causation. So this is just another thing to keep in mind, that people who eat the most red meat generally have the highest risk factors for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and a lot of other cardiometabolic conditions.
Wow.
So this was another meta-analysis, and these things, like the conclusions here are like inflammatory, right? The preponderance of evidence indicates that low-fat diets that reduce serum cholesterol do not reduce cardiovascular events or mortality. Specifically, diets that replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat do not convincingly reduce cardiovascular events or mortality. And so there's actually a couple of these meta-analyses that show that there is no reduction in cardiovascular events or mortality by reducing dietary saturated fat. And so my takeaway from this is, well, actually, we got one more study. This is saturated fat and cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, all-cause mortality. This was another meta-analysis and systemic review, and saturated fats are not associated with all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, ischemic stroke, or type 2 diabetes. So when I look at these things, when I see abnormal blood lipids or other metabolic markers, I take it as what's going on with this person's metabolism, and how can I fix their metabolism? Is it nutrition? Is it exercise? Is it sleep? Is it stress? So what's going on?
Yeah.
But one of the things I tell people is, for most people, do not be afraid of saturated fat intake. Now, if you're someone who eats a lot of saturated fat and then you have high blood lipids, reduce your saturated fat and see if it comes down. I take this on an individual basis. But if you're someone who's healthy, you're lean, you love eating steak every day, and your blood lipids and your A1C and your other biomarkers are fine, then there's no absolute reason for you to reduce your red meat or saturated fat intake.
You and I have talked about drug holidays several times, Richard, like on like how important that is for someone to be able to recognize the benefits of coming off of medications and see what that does to their overall like efficacy of their treatments and the overall goals that they have, right? Quality of life. You just mentioned something I love conceptually, is dietary holidays. When it comes to something like looking at a lipid panel, for example, how long would you recommend with a saturated fat, kind of review, even though you've shown me multiple meta-analyses that have kind of refuted the overall claim, but also said like they can be multifactorial, in the evidence. If we're going to eliminate saturated fat from a diet or reduce it significantly to be able to see the changes in your lipid panel, how long do you feel like that would be necessary for an individual to see those changes and then know if those dietary modifications are necessary or not?
Yeah, I usually do 3 months. 90 days is a pretty good indication of what's going on. And, whenever you change your nutrition plan around, there has to be some epigenetic and enzymatic changes, and that takes some time. So within 3 to 6 months, you should see a reduction in your biomarkers if you are one of those people who genetically cannot handle a higher saturated fat intake.
Excellent.
Yep. So this was a study that was actually just published, and this is looking at the health effects of unprocessed red meat, and it's what we call a burden of proof study. And they really did some really cool stuff with this study and made analysis. So some issues, other issues, we already talked about some with the observational studies, is that it appears that meat intake is not log linear, meaning that the difference from 0 to 100 is the same from 100 to 200, right? That as you go up in predefined increments, then the effect is linear. And it doesn't seem to be the case. There is a meta-analysis that showed there was no dose response. Oh, actually, spoiler alert. We'll talk about that later. Um, but that so the assumptions in the earlier studies were that it was a log linear effect. So it appears that it's not. And the other thing is not accounting for study heterogeneity, which is a problem, not adjusting for age. Well, most of the studies did adjust for age, smoking, sex, and BMI, but
Oh,
there are other things we know that matter, like the method of cooking. We'll talk about that. Regional dietary patterns, physical activity, socioeconomic status. These things all matter, and they weren't accounted for in a lot of these observational studies. So, what did this study find? Basically, that if you're eating up to 98 grams of red unprocessed meat per day,
mhm.
that's the 85th exposure percentile, you had a 6% increased risk of developing colorectal cancer. They said the association was weak and should not be used to make any kind of conclusive recommendations.
Got it.
Breast cancer up to about 70 grams was a 3% increased risk of breast cancer. For ischemic heart disease, it was 1%. Type 2 diabetes, it was 1%. There was no risk for ischemic or hemorrhagic stroke. There's no association between unprocessed red meat and combined all cause incidence and mortality. So, overall, all of this, to me, all of this evidence is showing that there's really no conclusive, solid evidence for the population in general to reduce red meat intake, unprocessed red meat intake. Of course, we should reduce processed foods. That's well established. All right. Then there's more evidence. So this study came out, I believe, a year ago, maybe 2 years ago,
Oh,
and this was a hmm?
this is interesting.
Yeah, this was a cross-sectional study of multiple different populations across the world. So they looked at total meat intake and life expectancy and childhood mortality. And you can see there's a linear association. As you eat more meat, your life expectancy increased, and then childhood mortality decreased. So this is a really interesting study showing across a variety of populations that if meat was killing us, it's doing a really poor job because the people who are eating the most meat are tending to live longer. And probably for reasons that we talked about earlier, the nutrient density.
What did they account for, Richard, in this one? Because obviously, one thing that I'm thinking right off the bat is socioeconomic status. For some countries and living organizations, meat is more expensive. For them to be able to bring in, and therefore there's sometimes a decreased likelihood of them having a longer life expectancy. Are those kinds of things being accounted for in this analysis?
That I can't remember. I can't remember in this one like what factors they controlled for and what they looked at.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is something that you will see in just general malnutrition in other countries. We know that decreases life expectancy,
Yeah.
right?
Fascinating.
Yeah, I thought this was really cool when it came out. Okay, so next, people were like, well, these are observational studies. That's not a randomized controlled trial. Okay, well, let's talk about a randomized controlled trial that looked at glycemic control and inflammatory biomarkers. In fact, this was a meta analysis of randomized controlled trials. And they had basically split the data into two groups: people who consume less than half a serving per day, that's about 35 grams or 1.25 ounces, versus those who consume more. And what they found was that there was no increased risk of developing cardiovascular disease, or sorry, the population were people at risk of developing cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes, and the studies were up to 16 weeks in duration. What they found was there's no difference in glucose, insulin levels, HOMA IR, CRP, IL-6, TNF alpha, and there was no dose response. So even the people who ate more
Huh.
than the point 0.5, right? They could eat more, and there was no increased effect.
Wow.
And this was in people at risk for cardiovascular disease. And a previous meta-analysis showed no difference in short-term changes in blood lipids, lipoproteins, or blood pressure measurements. And what was interesting was they did a subgroup analysis, and it showed no benefit in replacing red meat with other animal or plant-based proteins. So again, people saying, "Oh, red meat's inflammatory."
Right.
Well, this meta-analysis of multiple studies shows that there's no change in multiple cardiometabolic markers or glycemic markers or inflammatory biomarkers. So again, when you say red meat's inflammatory, what evidence are you basing that on? Because this meta-analysis of randomized trials is showing it's not.
Interesting. So interesting. And that was comparative, you said, to someone with a different protein intake. So if they're eating fish or something else, it still didn't show higher levels of inflammation.
Correct. Yep.
Wow. Fascinating. This one is eye opening.
So this one, so people tell me, oh, TMAO, TMAO, TMAO. So TMAO is a microbiome product of carnitine and other choline and other meat byproducts. And what we know is that in observational studies, higher levels of TMAO are associated with cardiovascular disease. That's observational study. So again, when I see these markers, blood markers in observational studies, what did I say I look for? I look for an MR, a Mendelian randomization study, because that can prove causation. So
Mhm.
this study and Mendelian randomizations, they find people with certain genetics that are going to predispose them to have higher levels of something. In this case, it was TMAO and carnitine, another meat digestion byproduct. And what they found was that genetically higher TMAO and carnitine levels were not associated with increased risk of diabetes, atrial fibrillation, coronary artery disease, MI, and stroke. They did find that people with type 2 diabetes and kidney disease have an increase in TMAO levels. So their hypothesis was that the observational evidence may be due to other confounding factors or reverse causation, that the diabetes and the kidney disease in the people who developed cardiovascular disease were actually the cause of the increased TMAO levels. And not only that, this next thing is really interesting. So, how is it mechanistically that TMAO may increase cardiovascular disease? Well, in experimental studies, TMAO can decrease reverse cholesterol efflux. It can alter bile synthesis. It can proliferate foam cell formation, vascular inflammation, platelet aggregation, and renal dysfunction. That sounds
Hmm.
really bad, right?
Yep, it does.
But those are experimental studies where you're basically exposing a cell culture or something like that to higher levels and seeing what happens, right? So that's not always going to correlate with what you see in the real world. Again, outcomes data trumps mechanistic data.
Amen.
And what I find is interesting is that there actually may be populations where TMAO could be a problem. And this could be in people who have dysbiosis, because this study was a genetic study where they looked at a certain species of bacteria that's abundant in healthy microbiomes, and that's Bilophila. And what Bilophila does is it can take TMAO that's created from the choline and carnitine in the gut and convert it into DMA. And so basically, there's no TMAO that reaches the circulation. And it's really interesting because other research shows that Bilophila is abundant in healthy controls compared to a group of people with cardiovascular disease. So it may be that, and we're starting to see this across a wide range of conditions, that differences in our microbiome and our microbiome's ability to respond to our environment can alter what happens to us metabolically. So I think that's really interesting. We're still in the infancy of this, but
Yeah.
in theory, you could in the future you could run a microbiome sample on people and be like, this is what you should eat, this is how you should exercise, this is how much sleep you need, these are the supplements that you should take, all that kind of stuff. These are the things you're at risk from because of your microbiome, because our microbiome is intricately involved with every single aspect of our health. So to
Right.
me, my takeaway from this is if you have a healthy microbiome that should respond, if you start eating more of something, your microbiome should change. And
Right.
let's say you start eating more meat, your microbiome should change to stuff that helps you with the digestion and the processing of proteins.
Mhm.
And this study showed that from a genetic level, the bilophila actually changes and is able to process more of these meat byproducts. I think that's really cool.
That's amazing.
Okay. Next, we talked about earlier how you cook your food matters. And so, if you look at red meat, how do most people consume their red meat? Grilling, right?
Right.
And exposure to high heat.
Hmm.
Well, temperature matters. So, when you cook things at high heats, you make things called heterocyclic amines. Heterocyclic amines in animal studies show gene mutations, DNA changes are linked to cancer. I haven't found any human studies linking these things. PAHs, or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, are linked to heart disease. They're linked to certain cancers. They're linked to impaired fetal development. And then AGEs, advanced glycolation in products.
Was
These
this
things
BS
are.
to you, Richard? Because
Hmm?
when you started mentioning this, like the first thing that popped in my head from pharmacy school was if you see grill marks, you've got PAHs, and that's going to increase your cancer risk. And here's all the problems with them. And I'm just curious, from your educational background, did you have that same kind of dogma pushed your way?
Yeah, I think ever since either it was pharmacy school or medical school, we did talk about how the charring of meats can create compounds that are not exactly in our best interest. And this is basically what these compounds are. These heterocyclic amines, these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and these AGEs, advanced glycolation in products. AGEs actually deplete antioxidants. They deplete nutrients involved in the generation of our own antioxidants. They're associated with oxidative damage in human and animal studies. And human studies do show that dietary AGEs do increase AGE levels in the blood. So you can reduce AGEs, which is a good thing, by how we cook and prepare our food. So
Cool.
there's some really cool things about this. Number one, I avoid high heat. What I mean by high heat is anything over 350. And I'm not saying be perfect. It's not like I never grill my food. I'm an 80-20 rule kind of guy. So most of the time, I'm preparing my food through like roasting or baking, also broiling or boiling and poaching and steaming, those types of low heat things. And then when I do use like a air fryer or something like that, or pan fry, I'm never going above medium heat. Most of the time, I'm on like low to medium, and then I limit my oven and air fryer to 350. Because if you look at the data, 350 degrees is really where you start to see a increase in the levels of these things. So, how can you prevent this? Well, how you cook your food actually matters. So, things that are antioxidants actually can decrease the formation of these things. So, seasoning your food actually helps you by preventing the formation of these things. So, things like anise, things like fennel, paprika, rosemary, oregano, cumin, ginger, lemongrass can help prevent the formation of heterocyclic amines and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Moisture can reduce AGEs, so adding in like a little bone broth into or chicken stock into the oven pan when you're putting food in the oven. Also, acidity. So acidic things can reduce the formation of AGE. So squeezing in a little lemon juice or a little vinegar can help. And then, like I mentioned, the main ways that we prevent this in our households is limiting temperature to 350, and then using things like boiling, poaching, steaming, stewing, and then limiting heat when I pan fry.
Got it. Wow, that's a good thing for the Walker household because the for the most part, I know that we do try to keep our temperatures below 350 and cook slow. We're an Instapot kind of family as well. But the one interesting piece that you really point out there that is not good for Kevin's grilling skills. When I come down to visit Richard, maybe you should handle the grill master stuff. Is I don't even look at the temperature, But now, hearing about this and the way that it can potentially manipulate our food, and the way that our proteins are being processed, really fascinating to think of going out there and actually monitoring the temperature on my propane grill to be able to bring those temperatures down or at least maintain them at a more reasonable level.
Yeah, and usually when I grill, it's like me and my dad, and we're just sitting out there talking. So I like that it takes a little bit longer time to cook because that's just more time I have to sit there and talk to my dad next to the grill and, just have that father son time. So to me, that's great.
I love it. I think that's a smart way to think about it too.
Okay. So finally, people were like, "Well, Richard, you hate animals and you want animals to suffer and meat, cows and stuff like that are bad for the environment." Okay. I tell them, "Yes, you are partially correct and partially not correct." So conventional livestock is just horrible. These cage bred animals and things like that. That's just horrible. And it's horrible for the animals, and it's also horrible for our environment. So conventional livestocking increases soil erosion, degrades water quality because of animal, manure and feces and stuff like that.
Hmm.
It increases carbon and nitrogen emissions due to manure management. But monocrop agriculture is not any better. What do I mean by monocrop agriculture? Is growing like these large, massive fields of one crop, wheat or soy or corn, because those mainly the crops that are grown. And if you look at the intake of ultra processed food, most of them are based on like wheat, soy, and corn, right? And that monocrop agriculture is actually horrible for the environment. So your Beyond Meat burger is not great for the environment. And so these monocrop agriculture, you have excessive fertilizers, excessive pesticides, you have compromised soil quality, it has higher water needs. Basically, there's more soil erosion, so the water doesn't stay in the soil as well. So you need more water. Then you have a large carbon footprint as well. You reduce the habitat for insects and wildlife due to all the pesticides. And also, what happens with soil erosion is you lose the ability for the soil to capture carbon. So what do? I look for, and if you can afford it, great. If you can't afford it, then do the best you can for your family, right? If you can afford it, I look for regenerative agriculture, regenerative farming. Places like ButcherBox was the first big one that became known for the quality of meats that they would use. You can also go local. There's a great website called Eat Wild where you can find local butchers to prepare meats for you.
Hmm.
And then you can always check out your local farmers market for seasonal fresh produce. But regenerative agriculture is better for the soil. You have better soil water retention. You have more crop resistance because you're not just growing one crop, you're growing multiple crops or rotating crops or having animals graze in the area, then growing crops. I'm not an ecologist or a farmer, right? But I've just learned a little bit about this through my work with Gaia Herbs. But you aid pollinators. There's less pesticides. There's actually improved carbon culture because you can actually add topsoil. And then studies are now showing that these foods grown in regenerative agriculture, because the soil has more nutrients, the soil is higher quality, you actually have better food nutrient density. So these are, we kind of talked about something outside of red meat here, but it goes into along with the argument of why a lot of people will say, well, I don't eat meat because of the environmental impact, but then, they're smashing a Twinkie with a diet soda. And I'm wondering, well, do you know the environmental impact of that? So,
Yeah, I think a couple things from this, Richard. One, I think my multi-generational family of farming, like we need to get them on a podcast with us sometime soon to be able to talk about some of these things because I think it's fascinating. Two, like you really highlighted the difference between ultra processed, high commercialization of farming and like open range farming and ranching, like the big differences between the two on the environmental impact, on the overall quality of end product, and at the exact same time, just thinking about the way that we perceive kind of the nature of farming and agriculture versus what's actually happening in other settings. The diversity of those settings can change the way nitrogen fixation works. It can change with the way that we're changing out crop rotations. It can decrease the utilization of pesticides. It can increase the overall environmental utilization of bees and other pollinators. So I think those things are just, it's fantastic to point out to let folks know that maybe from a certain kind of lifestyle or in a living situation, me being a country kid, you being a city guy, there are things that, you can see or be exposed to by looking a little bit further than just what you're seeing in a magazine, right? Of what farming is or what ranching is. And I think that's a really important kind of topic when we're thinking about red meats, to know that they don't always come from the same places. The burger that you're getting from McDonald's, or that you're getting from a large national chain, manufacturer, or supplier, is different than what you're getting from your local farmer or rancher, in terms of quality and animal treatment and all of those components.
Yep, absolutely. And last, to the people who think I kind of pulled this out of my you know what, these are all the studies that I used for this presentation. So, I'm very evidence based. I look at evidence. I look at the hierarchy of evidence, and we talked about a lot of meta analyses today, right? Because that's our highest level of evidence. And we even talked about, I think there was one or two umbrella reviews in here, which is a meta analysis of meta analysis. So that's an extraordinarily high level of evidence that you can put a lot of certainty behind that.
I love it. So any big takeaways for the men's channel and for other groups, Richard, when you and I are kind of talking about what do we do with all this information? I think the presentation really told us some of the inflammatory information that we saw before, that we had ingrained into us, that red meat causes inflammation, it causes heart attack, it causes other disease proliferation, and a cardiology standpoint, it can increase cancer risks. And now you're presenting us with data, that has been streamed over many years, a lot of them very recent though, within the last 2 years, that are showing very contradictory components to that, even pushing it to the extremes of showing that life expectancy and childhood mortality and several other elements are actually benefited through more consumption of red meat. So what's the big pieces that, if you could only have people take 3 things away from what we talked about today, what are they?
Yeah, absolutely. Number one thing is don't fear red meat. Because if you do, let's say you think red meat is bad, but you love red meat. Every time you eat red meat, you're going to get a stress reaction, which is worse for you than the red meat itself, right? And then the negative self-talk and beating yourself up and going through this cycle of creating a unhealthy relationship with food. Mm-hmm. So that's my number one thing. Number one, don't fear any type of food. I eat Skittles, I eat candy bars, I eat donuts, I eat pizza. Again, it's that 80-20 rule thing, right? And I know my carbohydrate, I know my calorie budget, and I just play inside my calorie budget. I don't demonize or make certain foods a hero. Their foods are foods, and they help me with my goals. Yep. The number 2 thing is biomarkers. Get them tested. And if things are abnormal, we oftentimes will downplay the results. Oh, yeah, my LDL is 150, and just kind of leave it at that. Well, I don't believe LDL is the best marker, but Mendelian randomization studies show that lifetime exposure to high levels of LDL is causative in cardiovascular disease, right? Now, it's most likely ApoB that's causing that, because LDL levels are correlated with all the bad markers are correlated basically to ApoB. So ApoB is the most important marker. But either way, that's the number one thing. If your levels are abnormal and you eat a lot of saturated fat, then decrease your saturated fat intake and see what happens. And
yeah, the 3-month kind of nugget I loved. I mean, just being able to see that, see if it's related to your potentially more microbiome, in general, or if it's something that's adaptive, but having a 3-month kind of gap to see, do those markers change after you've tested them? Beautiful. What's 3?
And number 3 is, when people tell you something, ask what their source is, and then know what level of evidence that source comes from. Because a lot of people in the online health space right now, they quote mechanistic data and try to use that as an outcomes data, but it's not. Or they'll use observational studies either way, right? And you have to realize the limitations of an observational study. And and then if someone's telling you, hey, this is from an umbrella review or a meta-analysis or a Mendelian randomization study, that's when you should really pay attention, right? And then see overall how things go, because studies are difficult, and they can, you can have studies point you in opposite directions. That's why you have to look at the evidence, in totality and overall.
I love it, Richard. So a couple things, I guess, for everybody that's listening and that will listen to Richard and I's conversation here and Richard's presentation, which, thank you, Richard. That was fantastic information for us to be able to process. The one thing that Rich and I love, disagreement. Like it is perfectly fine. If you totally disagree with anything we said, perfect. Be able to get a hold of us, talk to us about it. We can walk through it. Data is always changing, kind of shifting one way or the other, and it's a great conversation to have. One place that we love to be able to have that is on rphally.com. After you've joined, you can go to the men's channel and check out all the other amazing things that Richard's putting out there and other tests and studies to be able to help men and drop little nuggets like he did today that I love about, what's nice about not grilling at such high speeds? You get more time to be able to be with your dad out there visiting at the grill. And that's the other important thing. I think when we're getting together, it's not just the scientific basis of like how do we live healthier as men and women and healthcare practitioners, but also the sociologic kind of components of not food shaming yourself and adding actual inflammatory markers that have truly been evidence related onto your own bodies. And two, take advantage of some of those social atmospheres that you can create for yourself and your family. But any parting words for us, Richard?
No, that's just it. Give yourself some grace and enjoy life, right? But know the bounds, know the restraints, and know the parameters of the game.
Awesome. I love it. All right, everybody, have a good rest of the day.